acknowledging that there will be people that disagree with you, and there is a reason why they disagree with you, because their upbringing, their worldview is different. It's not wrong; it's just different.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Green Urbanist podcast. If you're new here, this podcast is all about how cities and built environment professionals can respond to the climate and biodiversity crises. My name is Ross O'Kelly. I'm delighted today to be joined by Mohit and Sue Yen of Decolonise Architecture.
My name is Mohit Buch. I'm currently a director at Decolonise Architecture, and I'm also a part two at Haysom Ward Miller Architects in Cambridge.
Hi, I'm Sue Yen. I'm new here to Decolonise Architecture, but like Mohit, I also did my part one at Bath, and then I went on to do my master's in Edinburgh. And right now I'm a designer at Yankatan Architects in London.
Decolonise Architecture is a solution-based group driven to tackle institutional racism and bias within architectural education and practice. In this episode, we discuss how architectural education and practice can be colonial in its approach and the problems with this. We talk about expanding the architectural education and practice to embrace other cultures and worldviews, and about how the architecture profession can be made more accessible to all. Now, although we're predominantly talking about architecture, actually a lot of what we discuss is relevant to other built environment professions, and I bring that perspective as a planner and urban designer as well to the conversation. So do keep listening, even if you're not an architect. I think you'll find it very thought-provoking and relevant to you as well, whether you're a planner or a landscape architect or an engineer or whatever. Particularly if you're working internationally, I think you'll find this quite a thought-provoking episode. So thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoy it and you get something out of it. And do go and follow Decolonise Architecture at their website, on their Instagram. The links are in the episode description. Thanks so much and enjoy the chat. We wanted to talk about your project, Decolonise Architecture. So yeah, maybe just start from the beginning. You know, what is it? Why did it start?
So Decolonise Architecture started off in the summer of 2020. It was when we were finishing our undergrad, and it was during COVID, and also it coincided with the murder of George Floyd. And so what had happened was that a number of students at the University of Bath were looking to facilitate institutional curriculum change within the university. And what it started off as a 200 signatory strong kind of open letter that was sent to the department. And then over the course of the summer, it turned into this slightly informal group of about 4 to 5 of us. The group was founded by Tanya Chiganze, and then since then, what we have been doing is working to provide a solutions-based approach to institutional racism and bias within architecture. I think one of the things that kind of underpins how DA works is that we've decided to opt for an approach of co-opting as opposed to coercing. So what we felt was right was essentially working with the stakeholders and the individuals that are in power at the moment, and essentially bringing everyone to the table, so that voices can be heard from a variety of different points of view, and whilst kind of maintaining the ideology that underpins the founding of DA at itself. And yeah, so that is kind of where DA has been. And over the last 3 years now, we have been working with a variety of universities, with a lot of support from the University of Bath, but then we've been working with other universities such as Bath Spa. We've worked with University of Edinburgh, and the Bauhaus University in Germany, and led student and faculty led kind of roundtables, which we called anti-racist forums, which were essentially sit down events, primarily online, with all of these different stakeholders, where students and faculty could air their opinions on where they think their department could improve, what they think they're doing well, and creating an environment where all of the individuals are aware of what needs to be done next in order to create an inclusive environment for everybody. And yeah, so in these kind of endeavors, we've had the help from numerous individuals, and Sue Yen being one of them. She's recently joined DA, and I think I'll pass it over to her to kind of talk about where we want to take DA in the future.
Yeah, so far, so DA so far has kind of, as Mohit explained, been this solution-based approach, because we realized that, lots of people were talking about decolonizing architecture, but we also acknowledge that policies and education is usually quite slow to catching up to what's being said on the ground. And so we wanted to be the people that kind of catalyze these changes that happen on an institutional level, not just talk about it, because we think, these two different forms of activism, kind of being vocal about it and actually working with the stakeholders, which sometimes are very difficult, but we believe that those two forms of activism need to kind of coexist. You need one to feed into another, and we wanted to be on the side that kind of was doing the bits that were a little bit more long-term based in a way. So a lot of the things that we've done so far are kind of short-term actions where we've talked to universities and helped them to reform their curriculums. But what we realized upon reflection was that there wasn't a lot of follow-up in these situations. And we wanted to kind of take accountability of these long-term impacts of the work that we've been doing, and actually assess how students are responding to these curriculum changes, and also how we can further bring forth changes within the institutions that have engaged with us throughout this process. And so kind of that's one way in which we want to kind of further the work we do with the educational institutions that we work for. But on top of that, we are starting to look into writing our own research. So our other team members who are all across the globe, we're interested in very different forms of decolonization. And we realized that a lot of our peers have written a lot of things to say, really important pieces, and we wanted to collect these voices. Sometimes they're student projects, sometimes they're essays, sometimes they're kind of design iterations, but we wanted to kind of create this archive of this student body of research, things that we have found, things that we've read, and almost curate an alternative form of architectural knowledge in a way that looks at this often unheard or unseen side that exists in our education today. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I could just add on to that, what Sue Yen put really well, I think the core understanding at the heart of what DA does is an acknowledgement that decolonizing is a multifaceted challenge and requires a multifaceted approach. Sometimes there can be misconceptions that decolonizing is, either only or primarily focused on race, or which race is a very big part of I guess one of the challenges that present day architectural education faces. However, at the core of it is that it is challenging the existing power structures, analyzing them, and seeing what can be done in order to create a more equitable environment for architectural students, faculty, and the wider kind of activities of the profession itself.
Great. Thank you for that overview. I think that's a really helpful starting point. And I think maybe to help people understand, I suppose, where this has come from, why it's important, I'll ask a really basic question, which is, at the moment, what is it about architecture that is colonial or colonized in a sense?
Of course, I think that this goes back to almost where we were to our founding, where when we started looking at different statistics and the different kind of what we call the leaky pipeline, where looking at the number of students that were entering part one at the start of their careers and how many students are graduating at the end of part three. And so who is, and we had seen there were statistics that showed that at the start, it is reasonably representative of the general population. However, as the stages progress, there is almost the minority students, almost that there's a significant drop off in the percentage that they make up within students that graduate at the end of part three. And so that was forming one part of our approach, where working with universities to see how can architecture be made accessible and remain accessible to students that come from a variety of backgrounds. And then on top of that, also looking at how architecture is taught within schools today. We, in a world today that is increasingly interconnected, a lot of students are graduating to work in practices that will have offices around the world. They might be doing international projects, and also with the benefit of international students coming to the UK to develop and to study. We think that there certainly needs to be a focus on what are global challenges, and simply a Eurocentric plus North American approach, which is so common in architecture today, is no longer suitable. And going back to what we'd mentioned about co-opting, not coercing, it's not about saying that, okay, no, you cannot talk about Corbusier anymore, you cannot talk about these canonical figures. It's about making sure that, as well as them, we're also giving the due importance to individuals and movements that have taken place around the world, because nothing developed in isolation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I completely agree that it's not just about replacing one canon with another, but rather it's an expansion of one's knowledge. And kind of like adding on to Mohit's point about this, in a way, leaky pipeline, kind of before this leaky pipeline even starts, there's this whole other barrier to entry into architectural education. Especially, in the UK, it's a very, very long course. It's 5-6 years of your life in education. And so to be able to be spending that much time and money in education requires a certain kind of privilege that comes with it. And it's also kind of a profession that you kind of don't grow up aspiring to, if you don't see people who look like you in the practice, the people who you look up, great architects, and you don't see people who look like you, and it's very, very discouraging. You don't think that you can be one of them, which is why representation is so, so important in this field, especially if we're starting to work in different countries. And also the spaces we're designing for are people, they're for different forms of people, not just people who look and think like us. And so kind of that's another way in which the profession has so far been, in a way, quite unfriendly to some kinds of people. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, it's making me sort of reflect on my experience in university studying planning and urban design. And I think I definitely learned a lot more about the, urban planning of ancient Greece and Rome than I did about Africa or Asia. But, contemporary Africa or Asia. So what is more relevant actually to people in practice today? And I had that experience of one of my early jobs was working in a global multidisciplinary practice, and I was working on projects in Nigeria, and I had, was literally starting from zero in terms of my knowledge of vernacular architecture and urban design in an African context. So yeah, I mean, the other thing that I'm reflecting on as well is that I have a couple of friends who are tutors on university courses, master's degrees in the likes of University College London, and they tell me that a lot of their in some cases the vast majority of their students are foreign students who are coming in from places like China, Korea, who are coming to London for that sort of what's seen as quite a globally elite or significant sort of education, really good university. And I'm not sure what the situation is in UCL, but it's likely they're getting obviously a very Western, very British European perspective on that, and then they may be going back to their home countries, without having that chance to really learn more about global architecture or design.
Yeah, and Mohit, I feel like you had that experience in some ways during your master's project, didn't you?
Yeah. I think one of the during our master's project, we were two of our groups we were based in India. The way our course worked, essentially, you spend a year, your sixth year, essentially, deep diving into one city around the world, and we happen to be in India, in the city of Udaipur. And what a lot of the kind of students from those groups felt, that there could certainly be a greater or deeper understanding of how challenges vary on the other side, on different sides of the world, and how a certain kind of design aspect that or approach that works over here may not always work in say India or Japan or whichever country. And it is about, I think, acknowledging that that cultures and the way people move, the way people inhabit their spaces will vary greatly, and almost starting from that point onwards, and then building up around that, and being open to the fact that you might arrive at an answer that you might not have previously thought. And
Anything from you, Sue Yen?
Yeah, I think there's kind of this aspect in architecture that you're being taught in schools, is that you're the principal designer as the architect, like you're in a way, the master planner. And that's something that really isn't the case in a lot of other cultures, where building is a lot more collaborative. It's a lot kind of, knowledge is not top down, but bottom up. And you find that in a lot of like indigenous cultures, where also they don't view the land as passive, because in architecture school, you're given a site and you're like, okay, this is your site, go and build on it, without even asking questions of like, who lives here, And I think there are all these questions about dismantling the way in which we view architecture kind of as this principal designer, abandoning kind of who and where power and control lies within the design process. These are things that kind of come from a very like colonial mindset of going into a place and kind of wanting to change it and reform it according to your personal needs. And so looking into the ways in which other cultures deal with issues of land and ways that they build differently, not just in terms of the construction process, but also in terms of materials, that architecture doesn't have to be this extractive relationship with the land. These are all things that we can start learning from other cultures if we start broadening and decolonizing our education.
That's really fascinating. I think that sort of mindset or paradigm aspect of it is really important, because it's almost like it's something we often inhabit without ever consciously thinking about it. And so that idea that if your entire education system is sort of within an enclosed sort of worldview. You don't even know you're in it. You just think that's architecture or that's how you do planning or
Exactly.
whatever.
And like language is so important in this conversation. For instance, like the word master plan, the word master in kind of like that already assumes a mastery of sorts in the designer. And then you start bringing up questions like who is a slave to this design and all of these things that need to kind of be questioned.
Oh my God, I'm going to second guess myself every time I say the word master plan from now on. Can we?
Language is a very powerful tool.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. I think sometimes I think people within Europe can think that colonization or colonialism was something that happened, in the past, hundreds of years ago when empires were spreading out around the world. I think something that is not as talked about as often in the mainstream is how, colonialism is really still alive and well in the world, unfortunately. I don't know
Just
if you want to
because
touch...
they have their own flags doesn't mean they're free.
So great. Well, great point. I'd love for you to talk a little bit around that and how that fits in with the architecture and the urbanism side of it.
Sure. I think one of the ways that we believe that that it's almost now, obviously it won't take place all the time as it would have as like in an occupying power, even though that is a very relevant topic today more than ever. But within architecture, I think we also have to look at the kind of the export of ideas and how is an idea viewed around the world. A very clear one is the skyscraper itself, where you now there is a common kind of approach in a lot of developing cities where the glass skyscraper is the be all and end all, and that is the correct answer for any environment, which by definition that cannot be true, because where you will have a desert climate, a tropical climate, and then you'll have a temperate climate. The architecture of those should not, it should be climatically responsive and and culturally responsive at the same time. And hence, it's wrong to almost idolize one design strategy and copy and paste that across the world, which is becoming increasingly more common. This does not necessarily mean that that you have to go completely on the other side of the spectrum and promote a sort of I believe regionalism is the term, where there can be no kind of overlap of or learning from other cultures. However, the fact that so many skylines today resorting to this copy and paste approach, I think a prime example is Jakarta, where they are. It is a sinking. It's a city that is sinking, and where there was a large amount of low density housing, it's now been transformed into medium and high density developments. And a lot of these are drawing vast quantities of water every day from deep wells drilled 100 to 200 meters into the ground. And this has to be, and as a result, the city, the rates of its sinking has increased, and it is placing this rapid urbanization is kind of placing a stress on its limited kind of groundwater resources and leaving these buildings and these structures vulnerable to collapse. And can also see parallel examples within the Middle East, where you will have glass towers with incredibly efficient mechanical systems. However, it still begs the question as to what justified the glass tower with oftentimes very little shading on the outside in the middle of a very solar a high solar kind of a very exposed environment. And I think that is one of the ways in which it manifests itself in today's design language, where certain design exports are seen as the key, and then hence they need to be replicated everywhere in the world.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, cause I grew up in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and we are also a country that we're a tropical country, but you just have all these glass skyscrapers, and then it's just AC blast every day, right? And I think, especially in the East, like people think that, you know, these countries have been, the British moved out such a long time ago. But I think there's an aspect that people, definitely in Malaysia at least, like, or even in Southeast Asia, people are still looking towards the West for examples. And so there's this kind of copy and paste attitude, as Mohit was explaining. And if all the eyes are pointed towards the West and everyone's trying to build like the West, then what gets built is something that isn't suitable for your climate, number one.
Building on that, it's also important to acknowledge that it is not one party's responsibility to ensure that the world is building responsibly. But however, I think the roots of this can still be traced back to the fact that in architecture schools around the world, the canon that's taught is still very Eurocentric, and it is still primarily focused on the same precedents that we focus on. And this is not, just coming from anecdotal experience. We've on social media, we've often engaged with and interacted with our followers from around the world, and we've asked them for contributions, and we've collaborated with them in the past, and time again, this is the same kind of feedback we get, that they will, it's this. I think there was someone in Brazil who was saying that the canon that they're taught is still very much Western Europe and North America, and I think that is where these kind of exports or remnants of colonialism can still be traced back to within today's world.
Yeah, and yet, like, if you look at it from another lens, kind of kind of neo-imperialism that still exists today, if you look at the materials which we build with and where these materials are being sourced from, there are these kind of parallels you can draw between extracting from a place that is so distant from you that, whatever happens there, you kind of almost, it's okay to do that because you don't see the kind of realities of what's happening. And sometimes what happens is that these materials that are being extracted from distant lands they take some time for something to happen, for natural disasters to happen, for instance. Say, for example, in Singapore, they are doing a lot of land reclamation, and that process of land reclamation requires a lot of sand. And that sand is being sourced from the rivers in Cambodia and in Thailand and Myanmar. And slowly, by chipping away at the sands from these rivers, to kind of expand the colony of another country. As a result, the countries where these materials are extracted from will suffer from that kind of violent extraction of materials. But it is something that isn't even kind of considered to be the responsibilities of whoever is taking those materials and resources, because, well, it's not there. It's not theirs to see, right? And so there's ways in which kind of this aspect of taking and from another, exploiting power over another one's land and resource and labor still exists today.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point that Sue Yen just made about sand mining, because I know for a fact this is quite a serious problem in India, where India is one of the, I think, highest cement consumers as a country within the world, and there are these groups called, colloquially can be referred to as sand mafias, where the illegal mining of sand and almost, corrupting the what Sue Yen was mentioning, the relationship that we have with the earth. It's seen as a purely this extractionist attitude, where it's assumed that the earth is simply there to serve us and we do not hold any responsibility to it. These often in the middle of the night, sand mining expeditions can result in have people being killed essentially over the mining of sand, and it is this perverse relationship with the earth that I think that we were getting at, where the earth is seen as something that is simply meant to provide for humans, whereas seeing it as a mutually beneficial relationship.
That is fascinating. I've never heard of that before. But I think this topic of extraction maybe brings us into talking about sustainability a bit more in a bit more of a focused way, because I think something that is, I think, really important to talk about with the green transition or decarbonization is that a lot of our electric technology and renewable energy technology requires minerals like lithium to be mined largely in the global south, and we will need a huge increase in the amount of mining that is happening for these kind of materials, also like copper. And so the effects of that on local ecosystems, but also the people who work there, often in really, really poor conditions, it's just really incredible. And it's really difficult to square that with the sort of aspirations for a fair and equitable, sustainable future that we all want and talk about.
You can't begin to decarbonize if you don't also decolonize. I think Leslie Loco described kind of these two aspects, decolonization and decarbonization, as two sides of the same coin, because as we have pointed out so many times through and through this conversation, that these two issues are so interrelated. Kind of the effects of colonialism has resulted in kind of the environmental breakdown of a lot of countries, more predominantly in the global south, because of this kind of violent extraction of resources. And so I also do not have the answer, but I think that kind of what we need to be moving towards is to kind of understand that there is a different way of building. There is a different way of kind of building a relationship with the earth that doesn't have to be so extractive, that doesn't have to only rely on these particular technologies, that kind of there are many, many ways in which you can do so many things. And the kind of conventional narratives are those of, these emerging technologies from the West. But there's so many ways that we know exist within the knowledge of indigenous cultures, that exist within the knowledge of people who live within climates that have very different sorts of weather conditions. And these are embodied knowledge that just isn't out there yet. And I think kind of, as Mohit said, it's not a one-size-fit-all solution. It's not like we have to mine all the lithium and all the cobalt and all the copper to build the most solar panels we can in the world, and that's all the energy we can have. That's not it, right? It's about kind of taking a very measured approach, knowing when to use what and when it's appropriate, and understanding that if you do have to extract resources from the earth, being very aware of kind of where it's coming from, how you're going to minimize the damage to kind of existing ecosystems, and also making sure that who and where you extract from do not get exploited in the process, both in terms of the labor and the land.
That's so great. That's so great. It's really well said. And I think connected to that, and I think one of the sad things is even in Britain and Europe, we're losing our traditional methods of building. I mean, I don't know about you guys, if in your architectural education you were ever taught about things like cob building and earth building, or building with stone, those sort of traditional materials. I'm shaking your head.
As in, so I don't think that we were taught that conventionally. But interestingly enough, one of my projects, my master's, was exploring kind of these vernacular ways of building within the UK. So using thatch and straw and cob. And it was this process of wanting to almost build differently and find something else that I realized kind of this interconnectedness between decolonizing and decarbonizing our education, and how these two kind of go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And I had to almost relearn and unlearn a lot of what I had been taught throughout my education as I was going through that process. And so, yeah, I think that definitely schools these days are seeming to embrace more sustainable forms of construction, and they're looking to, like, I know that, for example, in Edinburgh, one of the kind of new units is looking at earth buildings. So it is starting, these conversations are starting to happen. But I think Mohit and I just think that there needs to be more of them.
Yeah. And I think building on from Sue Yen's point, when looking at quote unquote traditional technologies or building methods, it's also about acknowledging that there is not a binary approach to building construction. You don't need to go full high tech or full, completely low tech and a completely passive approach. Like it's about acknowledging the fact that, a construction method from say 300, 400 years ago was also the product of its time and the material discoveries at that time. And for example, today we live very differently to people from previous years. We have different needs, and it's about seeing what can we take from those technologies, and how can we marry them to, I suppose, the discoveries and also human needs today, without having to completely reinvent the wheel every single time. There were answers that were provided by previous technologies, but then how can we adapt them to today? Because once again, replicating what was in the past as an answer for today, by brick or like detail by detail, if you will. It is also, we're not creating a product of its own time, because mankind has come on, and it is so it's about always balancing the needs of today versus what could be learned from the past.
Yeah, and I think architectural education is also something that is so rich and kind of involved in thinking about the future. It just, it's about a bunch of people coming together and thinking about building a better future, a better world. And to do that, you need the tools. You need all the tools you possibly can, not just ones that come from one toolbox that we've been teaching from so far. So kind of expanding this toolkit in which we have more forms of knowledge, more holistic education, number one, because you can't begin to almost dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. That's not my quote. That's by Audre Lorde. I wish I said that. But almost kind of this idea of, it's not a binary. It's more of an expansion of one's knowledge and bringing those things together. And I think there's so much potential in the education to help us to reimagine what a decolonized future looks like. We don't know what it looks like yet. We're still living in something that is very much colonized, just in ways that don't look the same, right? And so that's why we think it's really important to like focus on this aspect of architectural education, because it really helps one to imagine a different future.
And I think if I could just add one more thing on that, when Sue had mentioned the topic of unlearning, and I think that is a very important and almost under-discussed topic when it comes to decolonization, where you have to be open to the fact that you might be wrong, and this is on both sides of the fence, as it were. Like, you have to be, in order to truly take people's views on board, you have to be open to the fact that you do not have all the answers, and someone else might have a valid point of view, and accepting that ideas and are an amalgamation of of different parameters from different stakeholders, and as a result being open to disagreement and managing that healthily, and not shutting yourself off from people that will disagree with you, because I think that can sometimes, whilst you will be surrounded by people that will always say things that you want to hear, and you will always be surrounded by the right answer, but then by building that wall between yourself and people that you may disagree with, sometimes severely, I think you lose the benefits of compromise. I'll say, I think, because by taking opinions on board from a variety of different sources, what comes together is it is a positive at the end of the day.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, at the end of the day, it's not about kind of it's not about answering the questions in the right way, but about listening to what other people have to say about how they think things can be better. Because I think sometimes the way in which we kind of think of architecture conventionally is very one-sided, where kind of the architect is seen as the know-all, the person who kind of knows everything about the design and is this master designer. But actually, we start to break that down and we start to bring other people into the conversation, people that don't usually have a voice in the architectural and design process. Bringing these different stakeholders starts to almost shift this power dynamic that exists in the building industry today. And that also allows one to build a more holistic view of what's in front of the table, who's involved, who are your stakeholders. And you can see that that's actually a way in which we can start to hold these difficult conversations. And it's through these difficult conversations, kind of sticking with them, sticking with the troubles, and almost wrestling them. And they don't have to be resolved, but having these conversations is almost like the first step that needs to be taken.
This has been just a really insightful talk, and I just want to give you a chance in case there's anything before we wrap up. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about or touch on that we might have missed?
I think what the last conversation, the last points we just made were probably, in my opinion, they've been almost the driving ethos of DA over the last 3 years, where just acknowledging that there will be people that disagree with you, and there is a reason why they disagree with you, because their upbringing, their worldview is different. It's not wrong; it's just different, and just being open to the fact that what you know may not always get the right answer, and being able to just say that, put your hand up and say, okay, someone else might know this better than me, or someone else may be more competent in this, and then working with them. And it will also go the other way around, and acknowledging that there'll be a variety of answers that are possible, and there will never be a one size fits all solution is rarely the best way forward in this case.
So what is next for Decolonise Architecture?
Sure. Well, I think people that have been following DA may have noticed that we had been a bit quiet over the last year, and that is simply because we were doing masters. Like, it is, and masters is one of the hardest things that we have done. So I think now we are in 2024. We are looking at capitalizing on the things that we had learned in the past, and essentially putting out our own published content and our own think pieces, and also ensuring that we engage with universities and students in person and online a lot more, so that architectural and education of the built environment in general. This is not our approach. We don't like it to be centered on just architecture. There's other, equally influential fields that deserve to be a part of the conversation, and working with universities and students to ensure that there is an equitable access to architecture, and how can we do our part to platform voices and ideas that may have been sidelined in the past, so that everyone can learn from a what the world has to offer.
Where can people find out more about you? Like, so where would you like to point people towards?
Sure. Well, everything always has our name on it. So on Instagram, we are Decolonise Architecture and www.decolonisearchitecture.com. If anyone listening, like if you ever feel like, we could be doing something better, or you have an idea that we might not have covered, we have open messaging portals on our website. And obviously you can DM us on Instagram. And on our website, you can submit projects. You can, if you would like to work with us in the future, there are portals which point you in our direction, and we would love to have a chat with you. And yeah, this is a collective effort, so let's work together. Yeah.